Hi, I'm Quill Kukla. I'm a professor of philosophy here at Georgetown University, where I'm also a senior research scholar in the Kennedy Institute of Ethics. And I'm going to speak today about a non-ideal theory of sexual consent. Most of the literature and the discussion around sexual consent takes it for granted that consent requires a completely autonomous act of choice. And it's, of course, certainly true that people who have basically no autonomy because they're coerced or incapacitated can't consent to sex. But autonomy is not all or nothing. It's a continuum. We almost always act with partial autonomy, and our autonomy fluctuates from context to context. Compromises to our full autonomy are the norm, not the exception, or at least so I'm going to try to argue. There are at least two sources of compromised autonomy. On the one hand, we can be compromised in our intrinsic capacities, temporarily or permanently, for instance, by dementia, alcohol, exhaustion, or trauma. These things might undermine our ability to make a fully autonomous choice to have sex. On the other hand, we can be compromised by our external situation. This might be, for instance, because we're caught in a power relationship in which the person we're considering having sex with has too much control over us for our choice to be truly free. Or we might be in a disorienting context that we don't understand, considering doing things, the details and consequences of which we can't fully grasp or evaluate in advance. The thing is, we're rarely free of all such compromises. We almost never have pure, complete decisional freedom. Our capacities are finite and vulnerable. Our autonomy can be, and typically is, compromised by our relations of power and our subordination to others, our finite and imperfect capacities, our internalization of and bodily induction into norms that limit and distort our choices, and the various pressures and dependencies that make up our situation. So if we insist that real consent requires full autonomy, then virtually no sex will turn out to be consensual. Accepting this consequent would either make the notion of consent useless or it would turn all sex into rape, and neither of these is a helpful outcome. So we need to understand how sex can be consensual and ethically acceptable, even when we enter into it under autonomy compromising conditions. I'm focusing on sex, but notice that we could say the exact same thing about consent to medical treatment. And in fact, I arrived at thinking about the sexual context by way of thinking about medical consent. So my project here is to understand what consensual sex is in a way that doesn't depend on full autonomy. I want to understand consent under the non-ideal, messy conditions in which most sexual encounters actually happen. Consent does require some measure of autonomy, but I'll try to show it doesn't require full autonomy, and it requires more than just autonomy. So autonomy is neither necessary nor sufficient for consent. So here's a few definitions for my purposes. By autonomy, I just mean decisional capacity. There are different and broader definitions out there, but I'm stipulating what I mean by autonomy here. It's just the ability to freely decide. Agency is acting in ways that express our values, desires, and purposes, whether long-standing or fleeting, and in ways that have not been hijacked by others' goals and desires. So consensual activity, I can now define as activity in which everyone involved is, first of all, acting with agency, secondly, communicating that they're acting with agency, and third, able to use communication to successfully stop the activity or any part of it as soon as they want. They can exit the activity. Notice that I don't use the common phrase giving consent, because on my view, consenting is not a matter of granting someone permission to do something to you. It involves acting with agency in an ongoing way. So now I'm going to turn to examples of diminished autonomy in order to set up an analysis of how we might be able to scaffold agency and enable consensual sex under these conditions. I'm going to first look at cases of diminished internal capacities and then at cases where the compromise of autonomy is situational. Okay, so thinking about compromised capacities first. Our ability to make and communicate a self-reflective, informed choice to participate in sex can be limited by compromises in our cognitive capacities, whether temporary, permanent, or fluctuating. Alcohol and drugs can temporarily compromise capacities, for instance. Developmental disabilities could do so permanently. People with various forms of mental illness might have fluctuating capacities. I'm going to focus on the case of people with moderate dementia, many of whom live in care facilities, and the question of whether and how we need to be able to understand them as able to have consensual sex. We know that elderly people with dementia crave and take pleasure from touch, including sexual touch, long after they have lost other desires and pleasures. Indeed, a significant number of dementia patients become sexually aggressive and demanding. Sex later in life is correlated with lower rates of depression, more self-care, and higher markers of general well-being. Dementia is associated with an increase of libido in 14% of patients and with a decrease in almost none of them. This all seems powerful evidence that enabling people with dementia to have consensual sex, if possible, is important to their well-being. And yet the majority of nursing home staff report that it's not important for the residents to have the opportunity to remain sexually active. The standard view of nursing homes and their staff is that sexual activity among residents is unnecessary, icky, probably non-consensual, and hence best prevented. Moreover, nursing homes are typically places in which standard intimate connections have been severed or lost, and touch is highly regulated. Many residents come to nursing homes following the death of a longtime partner or spouse. Significantly, when nursing home residents with dementia try to start sexual relationships with one another, these are typically highly discouraged and institutionally interrupted, including through physical and spatial mechanisms such as doors that can't be locked and a lack of access to private space. So the entire nursing home environment is in an antagonistic relationship to residents' need for sexual intimacy. Moreover, our widespread cultural norm of treating elderly people as generally asexual and treating the entire topic of sex among the elderly as gross and off limits contributes to an environment in which elderly people have few resources for understanding and interpreting their own sexual desires or sorting the healthy from the dysfunctional ones. And this in itself impedes their sexual agency. I want to suggest that in an antagonistic environment of this sort, it's harder for someone with fluctuating and marginal capacities to actually be consensual. When the only way to have sex is furtively and in hiding, with the stress of being found out and punished for it, it's impossible to get the kind of social support that would make sex safer and that would provide a comfortable and easy place to go for redress if something went wrong. Stress enhances cognitive deficits, so residents who are sneaking around and breaking the rules are not likely to be at their most competent. They may well have no one safe to go to with questions or concerns if they have any. If they're already hiding their sexual activities, it may be harder for them to exit a sexual situation or relationship if they want to, especially if there are also mobility issues involved. So the typical nursing home, I'm arguing, undermines the possibility of consensual sex for people with dementia. But could someone with this level of dementia have consensual sex under the right conditions? Given many of these folks' real desire for sexual contact and the benefits of having it, it would be good to figure out conditions under which they can have consensual sex rather than just focusing on preventing it. I'm going to come back to a positive account, but first I'm going to talk about situational compromises to our autonomy. So looking at external situations that compromise autonomy now. Someone who has perfectly normal decisional and cognitive capacities can find themselves in all sorts of situations that compromise their ability to be fully autonomous in their choice whether or not to have sex. Most obviously, they might be forced or threatened, in which case the sex is unequivocally non-consensual. But there are more interesting cases for us to think about. Let's focus on cases in which the two partners have unequal power because of institutional roles, such as an advisor and a student, or a large age or status difference, or a difference in social stability, for example, a refugee and a citizen. It's easy to say we just shouldn't have sex across power differentials. However, this would rule out basically all sex, since it's very rare for two people to have exactly equal social power. So we have to be able to say something more nuanced. Perhaps the most difficult and pervasive example of sex across power differences that can undermine autonomy is heterosexual sex under patriarchy. Not only is there a standing power difference between men and women, but there are all sorts of reasons to think that women's autonomy, and especially their sexual autonomy, is substantially diminished under patriarchy, especially but not only in their interactions with heterosexual men. As feminist theorists have discussed and explored in depth, patriarchy diminishes women's ability to effectively refuse sex. It impedes their credibility as speakers and reporters of their experience, especially when it comes to rape and sexual assault. Growing up under patriarchy as a woman involves being inducted into attitudes and habits that are tangled deep within a pervasive set of social norms that train women to be passive about sex and quiet about their own sexual desires. It generally discourages them from being assertive or from thwarting men's social demands. And indeed, when women resist men's attempts to interact with them, they lay themselves open to violence and verbal abuse. Patriarchy is fundamentally structured by norms that demand that women serve men's needs, and sexuality is the paradigmatic arena where such servitude is demanded. Patriarchy undermines women's self-trust, which directly harms their ability to have reflective control over their actions. My goal here is not to lecture you on basic feminism, but rather to highlight the main ways in which patriarchy specifically works along multiple lines to curtail and undermine women's sexual autonomy. If we really think that consent requires full decisional autonomy, then it would seem that women could never consent to sex with men. But I take this to be an unreasonable conclusion. Any view of sexual consent, according to which the existence of patriarchy precludes women's consent to heterosexual sex, is on the face of it the wrong view of consent. For one thing, arguing that women can never consent to heterosexual sex makes the notion of rape nearly useless and unprosecutable. For another, it's unacceptably insulting and paternalistic to tell straight and bisexual women that none of the sex that they are having with men is consensual. And finally, for all of the many problems and pitfalls surrounding heterosexual sex, there's plenty of good, happy, wanted, fulfilling sex that in fact happens. So we need to ask how legitimate consent to heterosexual sex under patriarchy is possible for women. And more generally, we need to understand how consensual sex is possible across and within power relationships and webs of autonomy-limiting norms. Whatever the solution to this problem is, it's key that we recognize that it's not just going to be a matter of an individual man choosing not to avail himself of the power and privileges given to him by patriarchy. That an individual man decides that he will take no for an answer without responding abusively, or that he will attend and be responsive to a woman's expressed desires and discomforts isn't enough to restore her autonomy to her. Women are trained to acquiesce to men's requests and to fear hurting their feelings. This is embedded in the bodies of those of us who were raised as women. Many of the forces that reduce women's sexual autonomy are structural, not individual. Men can't just suspend the force of patriarchy at an individual level. Just choosing not to avail yourself of power doesn't make that power go away. Okay, and again, I'm going to come back to a positive account now of scaffolded consent in all of these cases, both internal and external, of compromised autonomy and consent. So what I want to do is I want to move on to a more positive account of how agency and the capacity to consent to sex can be supported when autonomy is compromised. I want to argue, building on a large body of feminist ethics and bioethics, that agency is a relational capacity. Agency is not something an individual has inside themselves. It's essentially supported by other people in the environment. The imaginative way into an understanding of agency as relational that I've found most helpful is Hilda Lindemann's concept of holding in personhood. Her core idea is that many of the roles, identities, and activities that are most central to our sense of self and our integrity require social and material support and participation. When we become less able to enact these things for ourselves, other people can take over some of the labor of maintaining us in our identities. She writes, this is a quote, "Even as none of us can form a personal identity without the help of many others, so none of us can maintain our identities all by ourselves. Many self-constituting social roles, for example, require others to take up reciprocal roles with respect to them. I can't be a mother if I don't have a child. To be held in my identity as a mother, my family and my friends and coworkers need to interact with me as someone who occupies that role." So in this sense, all of us need to be held in our identities through the uptake of others. But in particular, as our competence or our ability to hold on to ourselves wavers and becomes vulnerable, whether this is because of our internal capacities or our external situation, others need to step up and take over more of the labor of holding in selfhood for us. So here's another quote. She says, "Torn out of the context and conditions in which we can maintain our own sense of ourselves, we run the risk of losing sight of who we are, at least temporarily, until someone else can lend us a hand." Now, Lindemann focuses mostly on people who are in medical crisis or have dementia. She gives examples of everyday forms of recognition and maintenance, picking out a record for someone that accords with their tastes and adds to their collection, caring for and giving updates about their pets, for instance, giving them a manicure or a haircut, calling them by their professional title. These are small acts of self-care and self-maintenance that others can do for us. This doesn't mean that others act for us or instead of us, according to her. These would be ways of co-opting our personhood rather than holding us in personhood. Rather, others help us act as ourselves through giving us this kind of uptake and recognition. Now, where Lindemann speaks about holding in identity, I'm interested in the smaller scale project of holding in agency. That is, the more local project of helping someone to act as themselves and express themselves in action, especially when their own capacities and circumstances are insufficient for them to do this on their own. When it comes to an intimate sexual encounter, holding someone in their agency involves, among other things, being competently responsive to their gestures and their nascent expressions, while also respecting and understanding who they are and what they value. Partners generally can't hold people in agency all on their own. As we've seen, social, institutional, and material surroundings may help or hinder holding. As Lindemann so beautifully puts it, and this is another quote, "It is not only other people who hold us in our identities. Familiar places and things, beloved objects, pets, cherished rituals, one's own bed or favorite shirt can and do help us maintain our sense of self." A great deal of holding others in agency is a matter of giving them competent uptake. When we think about incompetent uptake and epistemic injustice in the sexual domain, we usually focus on the case of men's incompetence at hearing and understanding women's refusals of sex or attempts to exit sex. And this is indeed an example of pernicious incompetence, which is important. But especially when someone's autonomy is compromised or vulnerable, or when there are power relationships at work, competent uptake has a much larger role to play than this. A partner can protect a vulnerable partner's agency by giving competent uptake across the board, being a good, skilled, caring interpreter of their expressions of pleasure, pain, desire, embarrassment, comfort, fear, and the like. This means that one and the same person, someone with dementia, for instance, may be able to have consensual sex with one partner who has these skills and competencies and is committed to exercising them, and not with another. Their actual ability to consent to sex might vary from person to person. A nursing home facility that provides no private spaces or time alone and that disorients its residents by failing to create a home-like and familiar environment, and that presumes that sex is a pathological sign of dysfunction rather than an expression of agency, will be ill-equipped to sustain its residents' agency if they seek and value sexual intimacy. Any sex someone under these conditions has will be furtive and risky. Their actions will be medicalized if they are discovered. And this is pretty much the exact opposite of helping integrate them into agency. Similarly, a culture that brands women who want to have sex as sluts who must have some sort of ulterior motive, or which takes women who enjoy sex to be lacking in self-respect, inherently undermines their positive sexual agency. A culture and justice system that presumes that non-consensual sex is rare and only really happens to women who did something wrong will automatically be unable to give competent uptake to women who are trying to express their agency through sex. There's no reason to assume that we better protect someone's agency by not having sex with them than by having it. It's completely possible that someone may genuinely want a sexual encounter, and that encounter may be in keeping with their values and sense of self, even if they are a little bit drunk or have an impaired memory or limited reflective reasoning skills, or if they have less power than their partner, or if they're stuck within a system of misogynist norms that discount their sexual pleasures. A good partner can use trust, responsive uptake, the establishment of clear exit conditions, and the like in order to help give someone with compromised autonomy the stability and safety they need to express this agency. Conversely, someone who demeans or humiliates their partner or insults their intelligence or self-esteem doesn't thereby directly undermine consent, although these are other ways in which the sex can be unethical. But they do risk chipping away at their partner's ability to act with agency by undermining things like self-trust and a stable sense that one's own desires are worth expressing and protecting. These are ways of failing to hold the other in agency. So now that we have a reasonably rich, socially embedded picture of agency on board, we can extract some of the things that can prop up and scaffold consent from our discussion and list them more systematically. Many of the things that help to do this are also components of ethical sex more generally, components that do not reduce to autonomous choice. I claim that all of these can work in tandem or in any combination, and I'm going to go through a fairly long list of the tools that we can use now in order to scaffold consent and make consent possible under non-ideal conditions. So first, background trust between everyone involved. This is trust that everyone cares about one another's safety, boundaries, desires, and comfort, that everyone is alert to everyone else's expressions and communications, including those that are nascent or subtle, and is ready to give them competent uptake, and that beyond the boundaries of this encounter, everyone will protect one another's well-being and respect their privacy and integrity. How much trust and the type of trust involved depend on the context and the players. A one-night stand depends on a different kind of trust than sex within an extended relationship. Trying something emotionally challenging about which you feel ambivalent requires a different kind of trust than does having familiar sex with a long-term partner. Second, the concrete ability to exit an activity at will without recrimination or extended negotiation in a way that everyone involved can immediately recognize. I think this one's exceptionally important. There's a big difference between a partner telling me, "Don't worry, I won't do anything you don't want me to do," with the full social weight of his ability to do otherwise behind him on the one hand, and our establishing a safe word or another easy or unambiguous way to stop the action between us on the other. Third, competent uptake from one's partner, including their skills at understanding and responding what one is communicating, and their ability to read bodily responses and adjust and fine-tune on the fly. These skills generally can deepen over time. While I firmly believe that one-night stands can be lovely and ethically sound, a couple that develops and establishes competent communication over a long period of time can consent to a wider and more boundary-pushing range of activities with one another, and they can protect one another's agency more resiliently. Fourth, avoiding activities that are agency undermining in virtue of their content. Sexual activities shouldn't be degrading, gaslighting, or objectifying, for example. Degrading or objectifying role play might be parts of consensual ethical sex if everyone involved wants this, but actual degradation and objectification are incompatible with supporting agency. Fifth, a broader social context that doesn't undermine the agency of people who engage in the sexual activities at hand. Slut-shaming and strict norms controlling who we may have sex with and how, for example, remove the external scaffolding that supports agency within sex. Sixth, agency within sex depends on meaningful epistemic agency, not just in the sense that partners have to listen to and believe one another, but in the sense that everyone involved must have basic testimonial credibility outside of the sexual encounter as well. In short, people need to be believed, according to reasonable norms, when they report that sex was non-consensual. If they don't have the ability to meaningfully report violations of consent, this undermines the possibility of consensuality. Conversely, someone with reduced capacities who plausibly reports that sex was consensual also needs to be believed. Seventh, relatedly, in order to participate consensually in sex, people need redress if their consent is violated. They need to be able to hold their partners accountable in meaningful ways for not respecting their agency. Eighth, and finally, the last several points depend on everyone involved being socially connected, having a social support network, a check on reality, and a community that holds people accountable outside of the couple. Accordingly, a sexual partner who uses their power to socially isolate a partner undercuts her agency. So remember that what I've been doing here is trying to give a non-ideal theory of consent. The idea is not that all of these things that I just listed are necessary for consent, but rather that these are among the tools that can help to scaffold and enable consent, especially when other tools and situational factors are lacking. The capacity for consent is not all or nothing, in my view. Rather, it's bolstered or undermined by these sorts of tools and situations. When decisional autonomy is compromised, these forms of scaffolding become especially important in enabling the possibility of consensual sexual activity. That a sexual encounter is consensual leaves open other important ethical questions about it, such as whether it's degrading, whether it was initiated for good reasons, whether it constitutes a betrayal, whether it will put one or more of the partners at unacceptable risk, or whether it was negotiated in a way that was respectful, welcoming, and free of shame and other harmful emotional weapons, whether it's complicit in bad social norms. Consent is not the only ethical issue when it comes to sex. And I've also been arguing that consensuality and decisional autonomy are not the same. Consensuality ensures that our sexual activities express our own self-determination rather than being imposed or hijacked by others. Thank you.